Welcome. No, not to a distorted piano version of the second act of Debussy's opera Pelleas and Melisande, which you might have thought from the music of the introduction, but to the video from Greenwich Detective Fiction on Agatha Christie's 1926 The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And yes, it's not a Hollywood or even BBC soundtrack, this one. And I'll say right away that preparing a video on Agatha Christie is extremely daunting. She's just so popular. She's so beloved, and everyone has their own ideas about how her work's supposed to be read. I really risk offending a lot of people. It's not that I don't like Christie's work. On the contrary, I really appreciate its extraordinary artistry. I'm not going to try to denigrate it at all. It's just that I know how so many people regard her work as somehow theirs, that their interpretation, they feel, is the right one. Now, perhaps they'll think I'm overcomplicating matters, perhaps reading it through the wrong discourses, the wrong archives, or trying to destroy their pleasure. Well, that's a risk I'm willing to take, but please do stop now if you're in the slightest concerned that you and I might disagree. What I'm trying to do is to read texts, including The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, using particular methods whose validity we're exploring together on a third-year compulsory English course at the University of Greenwich. Now, those of you who follow Greenwich Detective Fiction on YouTube well know that we've been concerned to try to read a variety of texts suspiciously by focusing on a limited number of areas defined by keywords. Here's a very quick reminder yet again. These, I'm sure you'll recognize them, are the fundamental key terms, the fundamental areas. We look at what a text is, how and when and where it was published, for what kind of reader it was aimed at, either by the author or by its publishers. We look at the games the text plays with its readers and the clues it offers them in its game of detection. And we look at how the detection itself is modelled by certain characters, often, but not always, by a detective figure, or at least one who is concerned to investigate something. And then, and crucially for this particular video, we look at how the game is organized in terms of time. What does it mean to place one clue after or before another? One word or sentence or paragraph before another, maybe disrupting the chronology either obviously or not so obviously, as in The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, in fact. And we're also looking at what cultural knowledge the reader needs to understand the text to play the game of detection with the text. Now, I've called this cultural knowledge the archive, as well you know by now. As we'll see, and as we've seen already, we can play the game with the text, or we can play a game with the text, using a different archive, a different set of cultural knowledges from what readers used when the text was originally published. But I have to confess that my pleasure is always increased when I can access the archive a text was actually relying on. And a lot of what follows is concerned to show what happens exactly when we do that. Perhaps this is the point when, if you want to think about how The Murder of Roger Ackroyd fits or doesn't fit the rules of what's called the golden age of detective fiction, I should refer you forward in time to the videos about an author who's been described as Agatha Christie's successor, P.D. James. Now, I explore in the first video on An Unsuitable Job for a Woman by P.D. James, how that novel fits into the tradition of Golden Age writing, which means, of course, I have to sketch out what the rules, what the permitted and forbidden ingredients are. I have to say too that there's a very thorough and readable account of exactly this topic in chapter 4, The Rule of Three, of John Curran's fascinating Agatha Christie's Complete Secret Notebooks. Much recommended if you're an Agatha Christie fan.
Now, you might also want to watch the videos on a decided reaction against the Golden Age tradition, just to get an idea of what it's really not doing. And the videos on Raymond Chandler's The Lady in the Lake will help there. But to return to the 6 key words.
Now, these 6 words, these 6 things to focus on, aren't just randomly selected or have nothing to do with one another. At the end of the 3rd video on the murders in the Rue Morgue, I suggested that something called discourse connects them in certain ways. Now, discourse, I explain there that I'm using in a way I inherited from the historian philosopher Michel Foucault to mean a set of statements about the world that claim to be the truth, that claim to tell us how the world really is. Discourses enable certain statements to sound true. For example, if I said in full serious to you, as an ordinary common sense person in the street in the early 20th century, that everything I dream about comes true in reality, you'd think I was mad. The truth for early 20th century common sense was that dreams and reality were quite distinct. Dreams were meaningless. That's one discourse that we can interpret that statement through. However, if we turn to, again, early 20th century discourse, but this time the discourse of psychoanalysis, the understanding would be different. Maybe not the literal and obvious, the manifest meaning of the dream would be true in real life for psychoanalysis. But psychoanalysis assumes that there are hidden meanings to the dream which do relate to real life. Change the discourse, and the meaning of the text shifts for the reader, and a different game of detection, a different understanding will be needed with access to a different archive. Not the long history of common sense, which is actually very historically specific, much more than we might think. But if we are rigorous psychoanalysts, we'll use as our archive a specific body of texts centering on those by Sigmund Freud. Obviously, too, what discourses we use to interpret that statement, everything I dream comes true in reality, will affect our actions as well as our thinking. And that's why it's important to be alert for the operation of discourse.
Just look at this extract from chapter 8. It's a conflict of discourses, to be sure, even if the plain man, Inspector Raglan, gets the exact nature of the conflict wrong. Poirot is not a psychoanalyst, though he uses psychological methods. The common sense, plain, straight-talking, confident, perhaps arrogant, and because arrogant, stupid Inspector Raglan doesn't know what the discourse of psychoanalysis actually is, though he knows it's opposed to his plain common sense approach. Now, heed this conflict of discourses, as we'll be returning to it later in the video.
At the end of the last YouTube video on Henry Dunbar, I made a further suggestion. I proposed that the profit motive and the economic system based on it was an even bigger regulator than discourse. Or perhaps it's the discourse that assumes that's just common sense or human nature to desire profit. That's a huge regulator of the relationships of these 6 terms. And that, of course, includes novels, newspapers, magazines, which emphasize the written word, but all types of media, visual and auditory, because that's why you can see contemporary media down there. It's not just specific genre like detective fiction genre, it's everything. The same desire for increase motivates what discourses a text can activate in any specific circumstance. That's my hypothesis anyway. And if assumptions about reality are not welcome by the paying reader, and we are talking readers in this particular case, then readers won't pay for them. It's as simple as that. That is, though, itself an assumption about reality, a discourse. And in terms of Agatha Christie, it's very hard to deny her involvement in the capitalist organisation of the media, and it's that I want to turn to first, before then exploring the games that she plays with us, with archives and with time.
In 2018, the Guinness Book of Records put Agatha Christie first. She's the best-selling fiction author of all time, with, according to the Guinness Book of Records, 2 billion copies of her books sold by 2018. Everyone agrees that her work is the best-selling in the world. As anyone who's done the bestsellers course in the second year will know, it's hard, if not impossible, to establish the exact and real sales figures of any book, let alone of any author. Some sources you read will say that Agatha has only sold 1 billion, but frankly, whether 1 or 2 billion hardly matters. The question is that her work, her labour, generated an enormous amount of income. How much? The fact is that we, as members of the general public, can't really find out. And this is largely due to the business work of Agatha Christie herself. She was a very shrewd businesswoman, rather like Mary Braddon, actually. But in this case, Agatha went to some effort to avoid paying taxes, and she was herself very open about that. As a result of Christie's business acumen and her attitude to paying taxes, what we can find out about how much income her work generated and still generates is limited. According to Dan Clarendon, in a 2021 article for the finance site Market Realist, Christie set up the company Agatha Christie Limited in 1955 to manage the literary and media rights of her work. By 1955, there were already numerous film, theatre, and radio adaptations of her novels. She doesn't mention the company at all in her autobiography, though she finished her life story 10 years after the company was in fact founded. ACL, Agatha Christie Limited, still exists and is still in the family. James Pritchard, Christie's great-grandson, chairs and manages it. With his family, he owns 36% of ACL. The other 64% is owned by the American entertainment company RLJ Entertainment. RLJ became an AMC network subsidiary in 2018 when the latter entertainment company, which operates cable channels AMC, IFC, WeTV, and Sundance TV, amongst many other properties, spent $65 million to buy the company. As the AMC network's president said, "As we continue to focus on owning more IP and extending our content franchises, Agatha Christie Limited represents a great addition to our portfolio." Bully for you. I'm making this video in October 2022. AMC Network, which incidentally co-owns BBC America, a commercial channel which is not supported by the BBC license fee, you'll be pleased to know, along with several other networks and channels, is worth almost $1 billion. We know that, they have to be public about it. But Christie's work itself, how much exactly has it earned again? All I've really got is guesswork, such as these suspiciously round figures from the celebrity gossip site Celebworth. What is important, though, is confirmation of how the profit motive rules. That, in other words, the manipulation of the game of textual detection by the reader, with its plays with time and archive, discourse, resonance, personality and proximity, all these terms, is oriented towards increasing profits. We saw that with Braddon very explicitly, but also in various ways and to various extents with Poe, Maurice Leblanc, Conan Doyle, Richard Marsh, and we'll continue to see it in Raymond Chandler, Peter James, and Kwon Yo-sun. We can also see that the desire for gain is a fundamental motivator for crime in a lot, but not all, of the fiction on this course. Joseph Wilmot, Arsène Lupin, the character I'm calling V in Henry Dubar, the name-changing, shape-shifting woman in Matched, and so on. And of course, the murderer of Roger Ackroyd. Well, whether you think profit rules the work of other writers in the rest of this course really is up to you. But in helping you decide, I would urge you to always be suspicious of your own pleasures. Can we be readers at all without being part of a target demographic in a marketplace, without being an intended reader by somebody or something or some firm? Maybe the represented story doesn't depend on the assumption that greed lies at the bottom of crime, but the physical text itself will exist or have existed in a marketplace. We, on the whole, will have had to pay to read it. Now, I really hope it's possible that our reading can escape the market and the profit motive. And many of the suspicious readings I've been offering you and will continue to offer are intended to suggest that it is possible. But at the same time, I'm very aware that it's possible to incorporate all readings and uses of text into the for-profit system. Even if, as I suggested at the end of the second Sherlock Holmes video, perhaps the only way really to escape surveillance and capture and incorporation by capitalist system is by remaining illegible. And of course, that limits what we can do. I have just one more reminder in this general reflection before we get down and dirty to see how we can use some, at least, of our key terms and concepts to read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And that is to emphasize time. I want to emphasize an aspect of time on this slide at least, and this is the hermeneutic cycle or hermeneutic circle. I've seen both terms used. I prefer cycle myself as it implies some kind of movement through time. Now you'll recognize this image from the second video on Poe. It tries to explain how the reader is asked to activate and modify their archives of knowledge in a set sequence over time to create an illusion of detection and understanding. And the illusory nature of what we're doing is key for the ongoing game of reading as detection. And the idea of modification, of course, depends on the idea of time moving forward and back, forward and back. But overall, we read and decode and detect forward in a series of loops. Well, that's the theory anyway. But I suspect you'll see how that's how Poirot actually works. He offers to us and to his interlocutors a hypothesis based on the evidence he's already got. Then when more evidence comes to light, he modifies his hypothesis until, in the end, he and we finally arrive at the conclusion. That's exactly, of course, how we read as well. On The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, we may start off by thinking Parker the butler did it, and then perhaps Ralph Patten. Maybe we think Miss Russell the housekeeper, or the rough and uneducated young fellow who Shepherd says he meets by the gates of Fernley Park, and so on and so forth. Maybe you even suspect Flora. I have to confess, I did the first time, as she seemed too good to be true. The well-known critic Stephen Knight has argued that the relation of people in time and place is usually the central issue in Christie. And this relation is subject in her works to both scrutiny and deceit. There is, in fact, a huge pointer to the crucial importance of time right at the beginning of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd. It's a curiously precise sentence, but also vague at the same time. The dates are specified and the time Dr. Shepherd was called for. But when exactly Mrs. Ferrers dies is not specified. There's something mysterious about this. We only know it happened in the night time. Now, Poirot's understanding of time, of clock time sequence, was also a formal issue for Christie, and indeed a challenge for her. As she herself wrote in her autobiography, published in 1977, a year after her death, the idea for the plot, says Christie in her autobiography, came from two men. One was Christie's brother-in-law, but the other was no less than King Charles's mentor, Lord Mountbatten. The idea, though, wasn't the problem. It wasn't the idea, it was the execution that presented enormous difficulties. For how could Christie represent a narrator who's a murderer without giving the game away? Yes, the game, straight away. How could she do that? How could she sustain our ignorance of who the murderer was until almost the very end without cheating, without, in other words, completely deceiving us? Christie follows up that previous paragraph by again stressing how the game she's playing depends on ambiguous sentences that record timings, sequences of actions and events. Time, notice that. Or the sentences leave out certain sequences and actions. Dr. Shepherd is himself an active participant in the game. He seems to enjoy playing with the imagined reader while sticking to the truth and only lying by omission. If we're misled by red herrings and false clues, and there are plenty of those, it's because we don't attend to the main discourse that governs the narrative. But instead, we get distracted by details which do mean something, but which don't lead us to the identity of the murderer. It's some of these red herrings, false clues, and details that I'll be discussing towards the end of this video. To return to Stephen Knight, in effect, though he doesn't use the word mind, Stephen Knight's saying that a particular discourse about time is fundamental to supporting middle-class reality. It's a version of time that's factory time, clock time. It's a version of time that judges us, that decides who's a good citizen or not. Just think about how the university timetable works. Are we good students, or indeed good staff, by being in a particular place at a particular time? Maybe we like being naughty and not turning up. Maybe we actively refuse clock time. But to enjoy the pleasures of naughtiness, of disobedience or rebellion, we actually need to accept that being subject to the clock, that being turned into a subject by the clock, is the normal thing to do. Whether we like it or not, we are judged by our relationship to clock time in ways we aren't by, say, the length a task really takes us to do, the whittling of a walking stick, say, or writing a fabulous essay we know would be wonderful if only we had more days. Sorry, people, no extensions are possible. Clock time. We aren't defined by the changing light over the course of the day, which will of course be different in Pembrokeshire from Kent or the Hebrides, though the clock will tell us it's all the same time. Neither are we defined, unless we're farmers or gardeners, by the changing of the weather or the seasons, though we are defined by holiday dates and work times comprising a specific number of hours. Time for us good bourgeois industrial city dwellers is an abstract, mechanical, metal quality that we're measured against, an abstract quality that's imposed upon us, I wonder if we are clock cyber people, in fact. Similarly, place, says Knight, is defined for the responsible bourgeois subject, like us, not about how we as biological organisms feel or smell or taste it. Place is not defined by sensation, except when we're on holiday and playing at not being a responsible bourgeois subject. But neither, in fact, is place defined in spiritual terms of, say, hell, purgatory, earth, and the circles of heaven. Place, in the Murder of Roger Ackroyd and Agatha Christie, more generally, always has a function. A study, a dining room, a garden for growing marrows and chatting with your neighbours, a hallway, a garden, a street where you might meet or avoid neighbours to exchange information, a wood that saves time by offering a shortcut through it, or it's a wood where you won't be seen talking to someone that you don't want to be seen with. Or maybe we're talking about the position of chairs. We see the schedules of the suspects questioned by the police and Poirot, and in new to us, chronology of events is established. Truth is found by determining the exact linear sequence of the crime, which means establishing the exact sequence of movements in and between functional material space. In the fiction we're reading, and there's an exception in Lemon and to some extent in Henry Dunbar, time is initially posited as linear, as going forward straight as an arrow, as progress, as, in short, what Stephen Knight calls bourgeois time, clock time. But Christie knew time wasn't like that for everyone, everywhere. We know that too, don't we? And so did her readers. She and they knew that the idea of linear time as a standardized and measurable forward motion was a relatively recent one. It had become truly dominant with the triumph of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, as the growth of a number of reliable clocks and the idea of a nation unified by railways and by standardized clock time became more possible and enforceable. Don't forget that Agatha Christie was actually born in Victorian times in 1890, and, like many of us, she often visited aged relatives who would have remembered time before clocks had taken us over. She also knew and expected her readers to know that in the early 20th century, clock time had been shown to be only one version of time. Psychoanalysis, which we know is referred to in the novel, treats time differently. Psychoanalysis says the past is always with us, even if we don't know it. Salvador Dali's famous 1931 picture of melting clocks, called The Persistence of Memory, shows how memory can make hard metal clock time fluid, can turn the arrow of time into meandering flows with different layers and currents and an infinite ocean. If you've read Virginia Woolf, you'll know how this works in fiction. Mrs. Dalloway was published in 1925, a year before the Murder of Roger Ackroyd. And in a completely different discourse, physics, Albert Einstein had told us about the idea of space-time, first in 1905. He suggested that space and time were codependent. Later, Einstein described for the first time what he called gravitational time dilation, that there's an actual difference of elapsed time between events as measured by different observers, situated at varying distances from a huge mass, a mass with gravity, and that therefore the passage of time seems different depending on where you are. And as you'll know from science fiction, it also depends on how close to the speed of light you're going. In the 1930s, after she'd published The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, we know that Agatha Christie read a book published a year afterwards called An Experiment with Time. According to Christie's autobiography, sometime in the 1930s, and it's not clear, but certainly after The Murder of Roger Ackroyd was published, we know that she read a book that was published in 1927 called An Experiment with Time by J.W. Dunn. It was hugely influential on a wide variety of writers, including Tolkien and Agatha Christie herself, of course. No surprise, perhaps, that she read it while on an archaeological dig with her second husband, for isn't archaeology concerned with time in its own way? We're not going to go there, but I'm just pointing that out for you. Now, Dunn claimed that science and everyday life, while extremely valuable in themselves, had no way of explaining what the present moment was. Science has no way of conceptualizing the here and now of transitory lived experience. Instead, he proposed a series of dimensions that, he said, we can sometimes access in dreams. We can get out of the now, out of the moment, so as to be able to see fragments of the wider spans of time. That allows for both precognition, that is, foreseeing something, and memory, knowledge of the future as well as the past. Agatha Christie said that reading Dunn didn't give her, and I quote, a change of heart, not quite a change of outlook, but somehow she saw things more in proportion after reading it. She saw herself as less large, as only one facet of a whole, in a vast world with hundreds of interconnections. Every now and then, she wrote that she could be aware of herself, observing from some other plane of existence, observing herself existing. Yes, it sounds very Virginia Woolf, doesn't it? It sounds very modernist. And the passage shows, this is the reason I'm quoting it, the passage shows that she was already aware of the importance of time for how we understand our lives, for how we indeed read our lives, even before she read An Experiment with Time. For what she says the book gave her was less knowledge than comfort and serenity. It confirmed what she already knew. And it's the regaining of comfort and serenity by uncovering the deceptions and tricks and games of time, by putting all the fragments together and seeing them at a distance from some other plane of existence, that we achieve at the end of a classical detective novel such as Christie writes. To return to a passage from Christie's autobiography, at the end we're shown what was in the lapses of time concealed in an ambiguous sentence. We come out of the seriality of the time sequence, come out of the moment, and now at the end of The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, we're seeing the whole story from another plane of existence. And seeing that whole story is also the re-establishment of clock time. It's bourgeois time. It's a place where time must be accounted for, where time is accountable, where time is counted. To return to the comforting rules of that abstract system of bourgeois time is, in some ways, a spiritual, even religious experience. As we'll see when we come to Raymond Chandler, yes, who would have thought it, that we'd be discussing the spiritual implications of reading Agatha Christie. Now, by that, of course, I don't mean at all anything to do with organized religion. the spiritual implications here is an effect, if you like, of returning to and finally obeying the discourse of bourgeois time, of accountable time. And it's the discourse of clock time, the discourse that places bourgeois efficiency-orientated clock time. Remember the hermeneutic cycle from, 20 minutes ago? You'll remember that I said I preferred the term cycle to circle. A cycle implies a negotiation and movement of some sort in understanding. Well, that means, as I showed quite dramatically, I think, in the second video on Poe, that we read in sequence from left to right and top to bottom, in Roman script anyway, but sequence is really important. We move through time when we read to achieve understanding. But it's not a simple movement. To move forward, according to the hermeneutic cycle anyway, the theory of it, we also have to move back to what came before, either in the sentence or paragraph or chapter or story, or outside the narrative to our cultural memories. These archives, these memories, evidently are the little discrepancies in time, in the forward measurable movement of clock time. Now, if Shepard committed a murder in one of these discrepancies, what do we stand to gain from the little discrepancies in time that reading necessitates? Why, emotions, of course. Perhaps flattering pleasure stolen from clock time or added to it, or anxieties wedged in the white spaces that join and separate the words and then contained. I'm talking how the text encourages readers to mobilize their archives in the game being played, to mislead, to raise and contain anxieties, to educate, to flatter, and finally to put readers in their subservient places where we have paid to lose the game and to be amazed and dazzled by the skill displayed in the text. If maybe not quite a religious experience, isn't this dazzlement by a higher power one of the reasons we read fiction at all? Isn't this that, as Christie felt after reading Donne, gives us comfort and serenity? Well, whatever you think of that, you'll have to agree that the archives we use to decode texts are obviously dependent on time. And for the rest of this video, I want to focus on what archives we can find useful to understand the text, and certainly as far as I'm concerned, enjoy it more. Now, as you'll see right away, the Murder of Roger Ackroyd was first and foremost a commercial transaction. We should never forget that. For all we may talk about the spiritual aspects of time or the spiritual effects that reading this novel can apparently generate, we need to always ask who this spiritual effect is for. The spiritual is only one of the many possible rewards for Christie's intended readership, the educated middle and upper classes, with time and money to spare to buy the book, or at least borrow it from a lending library, or, with luck, a state-sponsored lending library by now, unlike, say, when Henry Dunbar was published, when there were only private ones. Now, the key thing is that the book was written over 1925 to 6. That is just 7 years after the end of the First World War, with its terrible toll not only on young men sent to die, but also on society in general. Now, although it's not a common way to read The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, I see it really as a post-First World War novel full of damaged men and anxious and yet powerful women who've been moulded into suspicion by sustained state propaganda. As well we know, the First World War mobilized technology, both metal and medical. Soldiers were often dwarfed by the machines and in turn were redefined by the medicine, both psychological and physical. Who had heard of shell shock before the First World War? But science was double-edged. The scientists were enlisted to develop effective new weapons like nerve gas, machine guns, tanks. Scientists were killers as well as saviors of the nation. And the same went for doctors too. At the most benign, even though doctors might try to help, their work was very often ineffective and their patients died or just didn't get better. Military doctors had indeed been tasked with curing soldiers, but rather than acting in the best interests of their health and survival, military doctors healed in order to return them to the front line and the likelihood of death. In war, as in fiction, the doctor could cause harm to his patient, there were very few women doctors at this time. This, of course, is in flagrant disregard for the Hippocratic Oath. Military doctors were also responsible for deciding who was a malingerer or not. That is, they had to decide who had injured themselves deliberately, simply in order to escape the fighting. Now, if a doctor called you a malingerer, you could be executed for a crime. And the role of the military doctor, therefore, was absolutely crucial. This new role of the medical profession in sending men to their deaths wasn't one that was easily forgotten. Even though doctors had worked hard over the entirety of the 19th century to show themselves professional and trustworthy saviors of life in the face of the opponents of vaccination and newly developed drugs, their failures and the demands made on them in World War I exacerbated the public's concerns about how trustworthy they really were. Now, this is very clear, of course, in the Murder of Roger Ackroyd, where the medical narrator of the novel, an apparently loyal, conservative, middle-class family doctor, is revealed to be a murderer and blackmailer. His name, of course, turns out to be very ironic, as he's most certainly not a shepherd of his flock, but he's more than a murderer. He's also a blackmailer. He breaks physician-patient confidentiality. That is, again, part of the Hippocratic Oath. Unlike the doctors, which used previously untried techniques upon soldiers, he abuses his position. The idea that a doctor might act against the interests of a patient would have offered a particularly powerful anxiety narrative in the years following the war, a very saleable narrative, of course, that both raises public anxiety and which, at the end, with the murderous doctor's discovery and his suicide, contains that anxiety, purifies society of wickedness, removes the bad doctor from it. There were other anxiety narratives deriving from the war. A major one was a renewed emphasis on gender destabilization and its attempted recuperation into an imagined normative hierarchy where men were more powerful and women were weaker. For during the First World War, though not to the extent of the Second World War, which we'll address soon enough, women had started to do many of the jobs that had previously been confined to men. By the end of the war, women had definitively proved that they were not weak, frail, or stupid creatures. Women had helped win the war actively, and at the same time overturned society's views about men's and women's roles. Now, one aspect of this challenge to previous ideas about gender difference was the right of 8.5 million women to vote in the general election of 1918. You had to be over the age of 30, plus you had to meet one of the following conditions. Were you a householder yourself or the wife of a householder? Did you occupy a property with an annual rent of £5? Were you a graduate of a British university, or were you similarly qualified but not a graduate? This was a gender revolution, and it's no surprise that not all men were happy. Certainly Dr. Shepherd is one of those. Men, in fact, come out pretty badly of the novel, with one exception, Hercule Poirot and his masculinity, which I'll discuss in a few minutes. We never really find out about Dr. Shepherd's backstory. Was he a doctor at the front who sent malingerers to be shot, or cured the wounded so that they go back and die? This is very unlike, say, Henry Dunbar, whose story we're told in detail. We don't know about Blunt either, though he exhibits many of the signs of trauma, of shell shock. Captain Ralph Patton's very handsome and will have served in the war and survived, but his rebellion against his stepfather was hardly courageous, and he's very irresponsible indeed with money. He promises he'll turn over a new leaf, but he just doesn't. He can't. Roger Ackroyd is a captain of industry, but he's also a bully. He's ungenerous, he's unforgiving, and ultimately he's weak. Shepherd despises him, as we'll see in a few minutes. The police officers are bumptious, arrogant, stupid. Geoffrey Raymond is efficient, but we know almost nothing about him. Did he serve in the war? We've no idea. Parker, the servant, the butler, is wretchedly subservient, a victim of his class position. One of the clearest remarks about the charade of masculinity is made by Dr. Shepherd about the other man at the mahjong table. From this comment that you see on the screen, we can see that masculinity is an act. The gruff military bearing is fake. And we also see that in the village, everyone needs to get on. And so, despite the existence of gossip, such masquerades of masculinity are allowed to continue, are indeed connived with. Now, the whole problem of masculinity in the novel seems summed up to me in this very famous 1915 propaganda poster designed by the artist Savile Lumley and released by the Parliamentary Recruiting Committee in order to encourage enlistment. The poster shows a daughter posing a question to her father. "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" While her brother is playing with soldiers and cannon on the floor. He's clearly already a great man and knows what he should do to be a great man. The father, though, looks rather worried. The poster was an attempt to shame men to join up, and it equated masculinity with active service. You couldn't be a real man unless you'd served in the military. Well, the answer to what they did in the Great War, as far as the men in the novel are concerned, is we aren't entirely sure. Their masculinity seems something of a masquerade. Oh, we do know a bit about Poirot, however. I mentioned earlier that we'd come on to discuss him. And while names in Christie are often conventionally indicative, like Major Blunt's, or they're misleading, as in Dr. Shepherd's case, Poirot's name is designed only to generate hilarity. Christie was supposed to have invented it by combining two names from two previous fictional French detectives, but its ridiculousness is surely its primary meaning. Poirot, who's short and middle-aged, if not elderly, vain and mustachioed, is hardly a Hercules, a tower of physical strength, and his surname suggests nothing but a grower of pears. In the Murder of Roger Ackroyd, he's actually a frustrated grower of vegetable marrows. He's really not a gardener of any kind, even if he'd like to be. He's a detective, and he is very definitely a refugee, an outsider. He's Belgian, as he makes it very clear to Shepherd, and it was because of Germany's invasion of Belgium, of course, that Britain entered the First World War in the first place. He's also a French-speaking Belgian, which means he's more obviously, to English-speakers, readers of the time at least, on the side of the Allies, of the British and French. His masculinity may be compromised or unconventional, but it's openly compromised, openly unconventional. And this open compromise, as regards gender roles, is foundational to his detective powers. He's outside the gender binary. It's as if he occupies a higher plane outside the immediate apparent differences that those of us who are enmeshed in the present moment, in the now, are so dazzled by. Women, as presented by Dr. Shepherd, are very different from the men. They're powerful, dangerously powerful. First, there's Caroline, of course, the murderous sisters, who he is clearly terrified of. He describes her in terms of a systematic organizer of the gathering of secrets, such as what he is harbouring himself. He presents her right at the beginning of the novel as at the centre of an intelligence corps. She gets servants and tradespeople to bring her secrets, and then she goes out in order to spread her version of them, exactly like the real military intelligence corps. Now, the real intelligence corps was a new invention brought on at the beginning of the war. It was formed, in fact, on the 5th of August 1914 and comprised both members of the army and metropolitan police officers, as well as specialised civilians who'd been identified by the War Office Intelligence Department as particularly useful. Now, the intelligence corps operated everywhere in the war, including behind enemy lines, and they were very successful in aiding the Allied war effort by providing vital information, though they were disbanded in 1918. Perhaps too dangerous? I don't know that, I must confess. The point is, though, that the bourgeois women, the voting women in King's Abbot, are in alliance with one another. Information and sharing it and gathering it and assessing it is their social glue. Not all women operate collectively in the novel, of course. In terms of other dangerous women, well, Mrs. Ferrers kills to escape her abusive husband, but Dr. Shepherd tries to suppress her, recuperate her in a way into the hierarchy by blackmailing her. Mrs. Ackroyd is assertive. Dr. Shepherd despises her and treats her accordingly. The very capable housekeeper, Miss Elizabeth Russell, he deceives. And she turns out, of course, to be an unmarried mother with a drug-addicted son. Is she really a threat to patriarchy? Well, clearly to Dr. Shepherd, but she's too assertive. She's too powerful. As for Flora, well, while in many ways very conventionally blonde and a heroine, it is she, after all, who brings Poirot into the case. It's she who's determined to face the truth, whatever it is. So unlike the men, with the exception of Poirot. And then there's Ursula, born Patton a major suspect for about 10 chapters. But in the end, she's hardly a threat to the patriarchy either, is she? Even if she would be going against the wishes of Roger Ackroyd. And then there's her sister, Mrs. Folliot, who gives Ursula a reference to get the job and hides their relationship. Basically, Mrs. Folliot knows how to play the game and is the same type of woman who helps her sisters as Caroline. Dr. Shepherd really doesn't like any of this. He's desperate to maintain the facade, the mask, the masquerade of his professional masculinity. What lies beneath that mask, that narrated mask that's so carefully crafted that constitutes the novel? Well, we know he's a murderer, a blackmailer, and eventually a suicide. We know he's obsessed with money. But what else? What lies behind the face of Dr. Crippen, who was hanged in Pentonville jail in 1910 for the murder of his wife? Can we tell? Not that I'm suggesting Dr. Shepherd was ever married. Indeed, what is he doing living with his sister, with not a single real friend? Well, look, we can never know. He's a fictional character, and he exists only through words on a handful of pages. How we read those pages, what we guess, lies beneath, lies behind. How we relate to the words, in other words, is a key part of the game the text is playing with us. All the above sounds terribly serious, and of course it is, but that doesn't prevent the novel from offering to play games with us in a very self-conscious, fun manner. For example, the word game itself appears 10 times in the course of the novel, the first twice in connection with Major Blunt's hunting in Africa, in basically the British colonies, one of the many signs of colonial history in this novel. But calling the animal objects of his killing game, while standard for the time, nonetheless suggests that killing is in general a game. And we are, I think, supposed to suspect that if Blunt is able to kill large animals, then he might be capable of killing a wealthy manufacturer as well, especially since the murder weapon, the Moroccan dagger, was a gift from him. Now, just a single time the word game is used to refer unambiguously to criminal activity. In chapter 13, Dr. Shepherd uses it to suggest to Poirot that Parker may have heard enough to realize the game was up. I'm sorry about that voice there. I'm sure that Dr. Shepherd wouldn't have spoken it like that. But he's suggesting that Parker might have got an accomplice to murder Ackroyd. Dr. Shepherd is, of course, himself playing a game by trying to get Poirot off his scent with this suggestion. Then there are a couple of suggestions, a couple of references to the social games we play, though they are ambiguous, such as between Dr. Shepherd and Mrs. Ackroyd when she demands attention and he gives it to her by offering a tonic. He doesn't once really think that she seriously needs one. He thinks she's playing a social game rather than being honest, and he capitalizes on it because, of course, although this isn't mentioned in the text, she would have to pay for the tonic. This is not the National Health. And finally, and the only time where Poirot himself uses the term, it refers to Ralph Patton's deceit of his stepfather in agreeing to marry Flora. The term, though, is used most insistently to describe the game of mahjong, hilariously narrated in chapter 16, an evening at mahjong, and it's to that I now want to turn very briefly. The game of mahjong that's played by Dr. Shepherd, by Caroline, and two friends, Colonel Carter, the blustering one who never served really in the First World War, and Miss Gannett, is very illuminating. Annalisa Hines tells us in a recent book that mahjong was invented in China in the early 19th century as a men's game, but came to be massively marketed by American manufacturers in the 1920s, especially to women, with a romantic fantasy, this was part of its brand image, that it was an ancient Chinese royal game. It wasn't. Players were encouraged to imagine an alliance with these mysterious ancient Chinese powers, and hence to feel themselves empowered. Mahjong would have been to Christie's readers a game, therefore, with feminine, even feminist associations. It shows the power of the women in getting an unmarried doctor and the colonel to play the game with them. And you can see that Carolyn is really in charge at the evening. It's pretty obvious that the Mahjong game is an encapsulation of the whole story. Its description is a reflection of the whole game of detection and secrecy that all these videos are concerned with, in fact. During the game, Shepherd gets a perfect hand, but foolishly, because he's flushed with success, he begins spilling the beans about his friendship with Poirot. In this, it's an extension of the two previous uses we've seen of the term game concerning social deceit, but it's also a sign that his downfall is coming. In a way, it's a precognition of the kind that Dunn's experiment in time described and that Agatha Christie herself embraced. So, of course, it's fictional, whereas Dunn was describing, or thought he was describing, real life. Now, there's a lot we can say about this hilarious chapter, from its polyphonic narrative style, where two games are going on, the exchange of knowledge, the gossip, if you like, and the mahjong. They interrupt one another and seem to have nothing to do with one another until we look from outside, as it were, from a higher plane, and realize that they counterpoint each other quite perfectly. There's a lot more we could say about the chapter, but we have to think about clock time. And so I want to move on to an even more explicit game that the text plays with its readers before coming to an end. I mean the several times that detective fiction itself is referred to. The first is when Miss Russell comes to see Dr. Shepherd in his surgery. The exchange reveals them both as readers of the genre of detective fiction. Dr. Shepherd is keen to capture and contain detection, so it doesn't enter real life. He wants to avoid that polyphony, if you like, that we saw in the previous slide of the Mahjong game. Detective stories, he says, aren't realistic, but they're just conventional, formulaic, exactly as we heard Henry Longville Mansell describe sensation novels. Of course, there's a multiple game going on here as well, as the conversation raises the possibility, given the medical discoveries of the First World War and after, that a murder might be indeed committed with a poison that normal Western science is powerless to detect. But that's a false trail, of course, but it's part of the amusement of the game that it raises that possibility. Later on, Dr. Shepherd is confirmed as a reader of detective fiction. Note how he connects detective fiction with newspapers, and also note the kind of reader he describes himself as, the middle-brow person of quite average ability, who's nonetheless intelligent. This is, of course, exactly the intended reader of Christie's novel. And then there's the reference to detective fiction in the conversation between Caroline and her brother about Poirot in chapter 11. Dr. Shepherd's annoyed that Caroline's got so much information from Poirot, and he's keen to demean the relationship she has with him. He imagines that Poirot is simply manipulating her. And of course, that implies that Poirot is not manipulating him. Oops. It's interesting that Dr. Shepherd takes his models from detective fiction, whereas Carolyn's information comes from an imaginary celebrity magazine, Society Snippets, a kind of 1920s okay, I imagine. And I'm reminded of Holmes consulting his newspaper file in A Scandal in Bohemia. Carolyn's doing the same kind of thing. Carolyn is referring to another case that Poirot solves, of course. While it doesn't exist as an actual story by Christie, it would have had very distinct effects of proximity for its readers, and may well, for all us readers knows at this point, be another clue that opens the murder out into a different dimension. Was maybe Roger Ackroyd something to do with the Bolsheviks? Was his murder a secret political one? Well, of course it wasn't, but for a moment we might be tempted to think that. After all, the rules of Golden Age detective fiction hadn't quite settled yet. The key reference in this passage is to a very topical story in the 1920s, and it concerns the hypothetical survival of one of the Russian Tsar's daughters, Anastasia. The question of whether the Princess Anastasia did survive the murder of her family or not arose again and again throughout the 1920s. Here we've got a picture of all four of the princesses on the cover of the Tatler from 1920, after the Times had broken the dreadful story of the murder of the Tsar and his family and their then small household that had taken place in 1918. While the press in 1920 reported that all of the family had died, they did mention how Anastasia had taken the longest to die of the family, in really horrible detail that. But soon the press was reporting stories of how Anastasia had managed to escape with the help of a soldier and was living under various aliases. The story achieved real prominence, though, only in early 1926, 6 months before the Murder of Roger Ackroyd was published in July. Curiously, and again in one of those precognitions that Dunn described and that Christie came to believe in, the story came to be especially prominent in 1928, 2 years after the publication of the novel. That's when various women claiming to be Anastasia popped up in Europe and America. And as the Belfast Telegraph commented, there was a lot of money at stake in being Anastasia, in fact. Now, all of this would have reinforced the effect of proximity and flattered the reader who was able to make the connection, which wouldn't have been difficult, I think, who was able to read the clue. But of course, it's another misleading clue. I want to end this section of the video, this video indeed really, on how delightfully ambiguous reading through one's cultural archives might be with just one more example. This might be a little unexpected if you don't know me, but if you do know me, you'll understand very well. Well, that was the music from the opening to this video, of course, and it's based on, as I said right at the beginning, to the opening of Act 2 of Debussy's opera Pelleas et Melisande. And for its opera that I want to turn to for a minute or two as a particular kind of archive. Opera figures on 2 occasions in the Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and there's only one other mention of music apart from 2 uses of the phrase, to face the music, once by Ursula and the second by her husband, Ralph Patten, who's obviously been listening to her. The other reference, the only other one that I'm going to mention here, is to an old-fashioned musical comedy. Dr. Shepherd means to describe Roger Ackroyd as a red-faced sportsman who always appeared early in the first act of an old-fashioned musical comedy, the setting being the village green. They usually sang a song about going up to London. Nowadays we have revues, and the country squire has died out of musical fashion. Now, that reference to dying out is a clue if ever there was one. But unlike Hollywood or television adaptation soundtracks, the only living music in the novel is opera. There are the two references to opera occur in the meeting of Blunt and Flora by the goldfish pond that Dr. Shepherd and Poirot overhear. The first reference you can see on the screen, and it's to the 1859 standard repertory work Faust by Gounod. It's a central character. Faust makes a pact with the devil to become young again, and he falls in love with the young Gretchen, who, in the end, saves him from hell. The meaning of the remarks about Blunt's willingness to sell his soul to be loved by a young woman is pretty clear. It means, I love you, Flora. Not blunt at all, that, is it? But there's another opera that's referred to in the conversation by the pool in the garden too. Major Blunt spots something golden in the pond. Well, it is a goldfish pond, so what would you expect? But rather than saying, it's a fish, dear Major, Flora suggests, rather ironically, that it might be a crown such as the character Melisande sees in an opera. Blunt's imperialist comment, or is it an anti-racist discourse in fact, when he compares opera unfavourably to African music, might distract us from the next comment. For that one suggests that again opera might be a mirror of his hopes. Is he the old chap old enough to be his beloved's father, and is Flora therefore Melisande? Well, she's brought it up, so maybe she's suggesting that that might be the case. But if we know the opera, we'll know that that plot line ends very badly indeed. The opera they're referring to is Pelleas and Melisande, a heavily symbolic one by the French composer Claude Debussy. It was first performed in Paris in 1902 and came to London's Covent Garden in 1909, 17 years before the Murder of Roger Ackroyd was published, though it was popular and performed quite a bit in Paris before the First World War. It concerns the marriage of a beautiful, golden-haired young woman found lost in a forest by the older aristocrat Gorlot. He marries her and takes her to his ancestral home, where Melisande meets Gorlot's handsome, dark younger brother, Pelleas. The first four acts trace the growing love between the young people and the growing jealousy of Gorlot until Gorlot murders his brother at the end of Act 4. Act 5 is one long and very quiet death scene for Melisande, who dies after having given birth to a daughter. Flora is too young to have seen a performance of the opera, because it wasn't on during the war or afterwards, though not in London anyway. Though she would have read about it, as it was very famous amongst the educated upper middle classes. Whereas Blunt, who's only a few years younger than her murdered uncle, almost certainly could have seen it either in London or Paris. But Christie's playing with us, for gold lost in water occurs twice in the opera. The first time is in the very first scene when Gorlot meets Melisande by a spring. Her crown is lying in the water next to her. She doesn't care about it, but to Gorlot and to the audience, at that point, it suggests that Melisande is of at least aristocratic, if not royal blood, and so suitable for him to marry. This is the moment that Flora is reminding the older Major Blunt of. She's suggesting that she's Melisande, and he is Gorlot. The trouble is that the opera also has a second moment when gold is lost in water. This is much more indirectly referred to. For at the beginning of Act 2, remember the music. Melisande plays catch with her wedding ring over a well with her husband's handsome younger brother Pelleas, and she symbolically drops the ring into the water. Pelleas and Melisande cannot find the wedding ring, and this is the beginning of Gorlot's rage against his younger brother. This second occurrence is obliquely referred to in the following passage after Poirot and Blunt reveal themselves and Poirot has rooted around in the pond for the lost golden thing. They let Blunt and Flora go ahead into the house on their own, and then they discuss what Poirot has found or not found in the pond. A passage is worth quoting and thinking about, even if it's quite long. First, Poirot himself elusively activates our operatic archive by commenting on Flora's golden hair. Long golden hair is one of the key attributes of Melisande, while Pelleas, like Ralph Patten, is dark and handsome. Of course, Poirot has found a lost ring, perhaps one that Flora lost, just as Melisande did. Of course, its inscription "from R" suggests it's from the young and handsome Ralph, a very curious resonance with, not an exact allusion to, the opera then. It seems to be suggesting that Flora and Ralph are already married, and that the Golo figure of Blunt will murder him because of it. Or are the roles reversed? And while the husband will murder the lover, the older man is now the lover, not the husband. What exciting possibilities! Ha! This all turns out to be yet another red herring, at least as far as solving who murdered Roger Ackroyd is concerned. For Ralph, as you know if you finished the novel, isn't interested in Flora at all. He's actually married to Ursula Bourne, and it's Ursula who threw the ring into the pond, not Flora.
Did you get all those plot possibilities? Did you have access to the Operatic or other archives so as to be able to play Agatha's game with her? No? Well, the wonderful thing is that the novel is written in such a brilliant way that you don't need to. If you did, well, isn't she flattering us on our knowledge? She's also misleading us, but she's adding to our pleasure in so doing. For the novel is written in such a clever way that we can ignore the references, the archival knowledge, and still be led up the same delightful mistaken garden path, or at least a related garden path. We'll know that something is going on. Readers may not know that the plot that the older man will kill the younger over a golden-haired woman, but they might still be led to guess that Ralph might be married to Flora, even if they can also see that Flora treats Blunt as a comforting father figure while he's attracted to her. Something's going to happen. Now, one of the key reasons the Agatha Christie industry is so lucrative, and we mustn't forget that, the reason that she's the most read author in the history of fiction publishing is surely the sheer skill with which she plays the game with us, the game of time that mobilizes our archives of knowledge in particular sequences, that raises possibilities and then dashes them, raises others, then dashes them again and again and again. Archives are used to distract, disorientate, complicate time, as well as provide real clues, like the Mahjong game, for example. What rules all, of course, is the desire to sell, the desire to be bought by as many as possible. And surely key to that is the skill of Christie's games with the many dimensions of time, archival or proleptic. Isn't hers just the perfect game?